Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. 4 years ago, one of our first guests on the podcast was a newspaper man, Jim Painter, who discussed the state of the media. Jim spent over 40 years in the business, starting his career as a boot-on-the-ground reporter and photojournalist, and ending as managing editor of Phoenix's West Valley View newspaper, with a circulation of 80,000 twice a week. What has happened since our last discussion? A handful of conglomerates control the media. Shrinking independent outlets, staff cuts, dominance of right-wing consolidation, and Google and Meta controlling 50% of digital ad revenues. Not good. An independent media is the cornerstone of a healthy democracy because it serves as a watchdog, informs the public, and ensures accountability. Are we screwed? Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We are back with Jim Painter. Jim, you were on our podcast 4 years ago. You were one of the absolute first people that we had on the podcast and discussed the press. It was a good podcast. Did either of you ever watch it again?
Yes.
I thought it was good. I thought it was really good. And Jim, you are a real newspaper guy, a boots on the ground guy. Started off as a in journalism school at Eastern Illinois University. We're buddies. We went to high school together, actually. You ended up working as a reporter and photojournalist. By the end of your career, you were a managing editor of a Phoenix paper with a circulation of 80,000 people twice a week, right at the peak of the press.
Right.
And what I would like to do is divide this podcast up into two parts. I really want to kind of come back with some of the things that we talked about 4 years ago and make an update and see where we're at now and whether our observations about the press and the media and the kind of the mess or the press uh, have changed. But I also want to talk about your book called Crossroads of Change. Why don't we start with that one? How about that?
All right. Sounds good.
And this is your second book, and it is a collection of your photos as a journalist. Tell me about the background about the how you came to do this book.
I mean, this was uh, literally a vanity project. I just wanted to uh, put together a book of some of my best news photos that I took back in uh, from 1977 up until the mid 90s when I was promoted to becoming an editor and actually had to put down the camera and turn that job over to somebody else. Uh, so most of my career I spent in with newspapers in what we call the West Valley here in the Phoenix area. So the everything west of Central Phoenix. So you've got the suburbs of in the Northwest Valley. There was Peoria, Glendale, Surprise, El Mirage, Sun City West. And down in the Southwest Valley, the paper I worked for down there covered five suburbs, Tolleson, Litchfield Park, Goodyear, Avondale, and Buckeye, two of which are among the fastest growing cities in the United States right now, Buckeye and Goodyear. And the newspaper I worked for, the West Valley View, was started in 1986, and I joined up as a part timer because I knew the publisher. I'd worked for his parents for the daily paper they owned in the Northwest Valley called the Daily News Sun, and so we got in before this area's growth began. And it was a different type of newspaper than the locals were used to. there was a weekly paper here already, but it was one of those papers that basically it was a mom and pop operation, and they uh, published, for example, the sports stories were written by the coaches.
Oh God.
The coverage of the city council meetings was written by the mayor or somebody else within the city. So, I mean, there was no objective coverage of the public institutions out here until we arrived. And they actually were pretty hostile to us at first, all of them, because they weren't used to having somebody look over their shoulder while they were and challenge them. Uh, for example, the city of Goodyear had annexed a huge swath of land south of the Gila River that was owned by Charles Keating, if you may recall.
The Keating Five or the Keating Seven?
The Keating Five.
Keating Five.
Charlie Keating is largely responsible for the S&L scandal of the late 1980s. But the city of Goodyear, the city council had an executive session that included Keating, which was a violation of the Arizona Open Meetings Law. And if our paper hadn't been there with a reporter at that meeting, this would have gone unnoticed. The
Mhm.
fact that they were violating the Open Meetings Law. But we challenged them, got the Arizona Attorney General's office involved, and they basically told them that they had to release the minutes of the executive session and any decisions that they made, which legally they can't vote in executive sessions on anything. So any decisions that were made in that session had to be negated. So and that's because we had a reporter there. And that's what we lose when we lose local newspapers.
You know, Jim, you're being a little too modest, I think. You started your career and ended up in Arizona, and the boom that occurred in Arizona is probably unprecedented in any other part of our country, the number of people that came in. And you ended up covering um, Sheriff Arpaio, for example, which was this very, very corrupt sheriff. Your paper literally brought him down, if you will.
Oh, I don't
Uh,
think, no, we were just one of the many that helped bring him down.
okay, all right. Well, it's a better story if you did bring it
Yeah.
down, but I'll fix that. And also the history of the power and the heyday of the press, the press at its absolute peak. You were involved with that. And then it just kind of all, I think we talked about this in our previous podcast, it all just kind of went to hell in a handbasket with
Very
law.
quickly.
Oh, tell us about how you saw the decline in 2008 or in that approximately that
Yeah, it
area. What happened to the press?
started in 2008, and there were several factors that were involved in weakening, the press, the newspapers, anyway. And of course, one of those was the recession, and that hurt us because it hurt our advertisers. And our biggest advertisers were like car dealers and real estate agents. And these were the people who were buying full page color ads in our paper. Well, when the recession hit, they had to cut back drastically on their advertising budgets. And that really hurt local newspapers. Uh, and another factor was Craigslist. Uh, Local papers depended a lot on classified advertising for revenue, but Craigslist came along and offering classified ads for free. So why wouldn't somebody buy an ad in a newspaper? And and then when as the internet was just really starting to take off then, and advertisers were discovering that, hey, we can just, create our own advertising using the internet. We don't need newspapers anymore to get the word out about our products or our services. And so this all happened about the same time, and it happened very quickly. I mean, within a matter of months, we went from publishing, like 96 pages per week down to 48. you know. And of course, that as that went on for a couple years, there was no way that we could continue to employ the number of reporters and photographers and editors that we had. So we had to start laying people off.
Mhm.
And eventually that included me.
Last time we talked, I mentioned a story of Greg sending me information, kind of correcting one of my statements that I made about China. And Greg, we send articles back and forth a lot, but just this last week, you must have sent me about 6 or 7 articles, and they were phenomenal. I mean, they were insightful. They were looking at current events, and I would say of all of the content of the articles that you sent me, Greg, none of the themes or content showed up in any of the newspapers, any of the major newspapers, the Washington Post or your paper, Jim. The newspaper that would have been at the heyday. So is that good or bad? What do you think, Greg?
Well, I don't think the establishment media responded well to the competition as things were changing technologically and people were going to the internet for more and more information from more and more sources. Um, it used to be the challenges to the mainstream media really came from these small little weekly papers and so on that were circulated in the cities and so on. But the internet posed a real challenge, and I don't think the mainstream media really responded. They thought they were kind of smug about it, and they kind of thought it would go away or wouldn't amount to much. But it really challenged the mainstream, media going forward. And it's a very fluid situation, I think. I don't know if Jim would agree or not, but when you look at the media in a broadest sense, entertainment, news, it's really a fluid situation changing. Patreon now is a big phenomena. I just read a comment from one of our perspective on X, our perspective uh, guests, she said, "Well, I think information should be free, and that's why I give my stuff out for free." But people have to make a living. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that are on Patreon now that's their only source of income as writers. And so it's just a very fluid, awkward. It's like our politics today. The moment we're in is the media is in the same kind of a moment. Uh, where's this going to go? I don't know.
Yeah, I remember when, back then, in when the internet was just taking off and uh, taking a lot of business away from newspapers. And frankly, we didn't know how to deal with it. We didn't know how, like all of a sudden, should we have a website of our own? And, or not? If we do we put up a paywall or do we allow people to view our stories for free? Uh, what about, like when people post comments on stories, should we edit those? Should we, and we were talking to attorneys, media specialists in media law, and they didn't really know, like, okay, we were getting mixed signals from various different attorneys, like, well, you should edit those things. Or no, you shouldn't edit those things because if you do, then that makes you even more liable if you get sued for libel because of one of the posts. But if you don't edit them at all, then it's like it's not our fault. We don't We have nothing to do with these comments that are posted on our website. We don't edit them in any way. People are free to post whatever they want to post. So, I mean, there was a lot of confusion back then, and a lot of newspapers made bad decisions, and they're still paying for it today.
I don't want to overvalue the wonderful age of journalism because if you look at Bob Macheski, who's a University of Illinois professor that died just this last week, absolute one of my heroes. I listened to his show weekly on WILL. He'd do a show on them called On the, I think On the Media was his show, and he'd bring in different guests and Howard Zinn, Chomsky, and so forth. And he'll say that there was always problems with objectivity in journalism going back to
Oh, oh, oh. The idea of objectivity in journalism is crazy. It's never
correct.
been objective. It was
Right.
never meant to be objective in this country.
Okay. Okay. That's part of my point. But my other part of my point was that when you were an editor and when you sent you people out to cover stories, or there was a established kind of protocol that you followed. There was, you don't have enough sources. I'm not publishing that. Or uh, there was some degree of oversight about that. You mentioned in our last podcast that you went to a board meeting of the Washington Post 2 years before we did our podcast, and Bezos had taken over the paper, and everybody it was saying, "Oh, that's just horrible. It's all going to fall apart." And you said that according to your observations at the time, that no, he was allowing the established procedure of the editor, having some autonomy, that he was allowing that to occur. And you were right up until a couple of months ago.
Right, right, yeah.
Up until a couple of months ago, you were right about that. So tell me about that whole ritual and procedure of how journalism worked and how that served to at least correct to some degree the profession and the efficacy of the reporting. Does the newsroom now look like the newsroom back when you back in mid '80s? No, right?
I really can't say for sure since I haven't been in a newsroom in a while.
Uh-huh.
But uh, I would say, I mean, if you're looking at the history of newspapers in this country, there have always, the big papers have always been owned by rich people. And a lot of the publishers and owners of the newspapers were not journalists. They were just business people who wanted, newspapers made a lot of money and they wanted to get in on it. They didn't have journalism backgrounds. But for the most part, owners like that would take a hands-off approach to the newsroom. They'd say, "Well, let the experts, the editors, the people with journalism degrees decide what the content is going to be. As long as I'm making money, I don't care." And so you had situations where you might have somebody, a very rich person who owned a newspaper chain, and the newspapers within that chain, some of them were conservative, some of them were liberal, some of them were, centrist. So, they didn't care as long as they were making money, and they kept a hands-off approach to the newsroom. I don't know if that's going on today. I don't know how much influence people like Bezos have in the newsroom today, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well,
apparently he's having some influence over it.
Right, right.
I think the classic model, I'm not endorsing it, but I think the classic model of a workable media under capitalism in a country that's a capitalist country was a market model. So the idea was not to make each individual newspaper adhere to some kind of idealistic objectivity or allow all perspectives to flow or whatever. That wasn't the idea. The idea was to have multiple newspapers available to people reflecting political slants and angles and so on. So in Europe, for example, it probably worked far better because they had multiple parties, and each party would have newspaper owners would say, well, I'm going to reflect that party because they've got a following, and therefore I can make money by delivering what they want to hear. And so you might have 4 or 5 parties. A country like France, you'd even have the labor unions have newspapers. So they'd reflect other views beyond the capitalist views. You'd even have communist papers. L'Humanité in France had a huge circulation at that time. So at least that model made some sense. But the notion that any individual newspaper should reflect all positions, which in this two-party environment where you only really have two choices, binary world we live in, it doesn't work at all. It can't work at all. It just can't work in that environment. It keeps so much out of the picture because they're not part of the mainstream. And the trade unions they have no interest in being a voice for anything. They believe in the system as it is. So we're stuck with that and it only gets worse. I think that's the long history of journalism in this country. It just gets worse and worse and worse because it's controlled solely by money.
Jim, what's your thoughts about the New York Times and Washington Post? Are they making money? Are they doing okay? I mean, all the other papers are barely hanging on, but
I
they
don't know.
still.
They claim to be. So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah.
the Washington Post, they don't need to make money. They've got Bezos's money behind them.
Right.
So
Right.
they don't, they're not so dependent on advertising anymore.
One thing that I've noticed, that's kind of shocking to me. Greg, you sent me the article 2 days ago with Lawrence. Forget his name. He was talking about the bias in
Patrick Lawrence. Patrick Lawrence.
Patrick Lawrence, talking about the bias in the reporting of Gaza and the conflict there. And Jonathan Cook, I think you've sent me, the British journalism has just made it a project to expose the bias of the Guardian and how the Guardians covered these conflicts. And it strikes me that and I think they are correct. They're correct that there is a genocide occurring. It's occurring right in front of us. It's selectively being reported on. This idea of the human shields being everywhere to justify that amount of destruction is just beyond the pale. Just literally right in front of us is occurring just this atrocity, and the justification of anti-Semitism on the rise is giving cover to the fact that these horrible things are occurring. When you read these other journalists that are covering this, Seymour Hersh, Jonathan Cook, Patrick Lawrence, it's absolutely, to me, clear that they're correct. And you don't see any of that in our mainstream reporting. 60 Minutes did a story last week. The whole segment was just how horrible it is for these handful of hostages still remaining in the tunnels in Gaza. And it's heartfelt. It was correct. I mean, it's a bad thing. But they didn't mention that there's not one hospital functioning in all of Gaza because they've been all destroyed. Thoughts about that? Thoughts about how maybe these large newspapers have kind of created their own problem by their obvious bias in how they approach covering the news?
Like I said, I mean, if you look at the history of journalism in the United States, it, newspapers, going back to the revolution, I mean, they were never unbiased. They were started to get across a specific point of view of the publisher. And that's the way it's always been, I believe. So, I mean, it's nothing new. It's not a new phenomenon. And that's why you need multiple sources for your news. I mean, because no two newspapers take the same uh, point of view. So, I mean, you have those that are liberal, those that are conservative, and those that are more middle of the road. So if you read multiple newspapers every day, or try to, and then hopefully you'll get a clearer picture of what's going on in the world.
Do you think you're more informed now, Greg, than you were 10 years ago?
That's a good question. That's a good question, Pat. I don't really know how to answer that. I have to work harder, if you mean that. I have to work harder to get what I'm satisfied with as far as information goes. I found it easier to turn to straightforward sources 20 years ago. Today, I have to really forage around for information. If I want to know about Gaza, I've got to go looking for it. Uh, one of the, even in the mainstream media, what's striking is in foreign affairs, which I think we're talking a bit about here, about what's going on in the rest of the world, not just in our backyard. The days of having correspondence in countries is kind of long gone. Much of the war in Syria was reported from Beirut, which is in a different country. Nobody would go to Syria to actually see what was going on. They would, and more, there's a laziness. I mean, I think the picture I used to have of a journalist, which goes back to these 30 movies of some working class guy that wants to find a niche in life and goes out there and grabs news, it's kind of gone. It's been replaced by people that go to Columbia Journalism School or go to Sarah Lawrence or go to some Ivy League school and decide this might be a good career choice to go into some other things in the future. So people are they're more accepting to just take the handouts from the U.S. Embassy they were in the past, which makes it harder for us to forage information, real information. We either go along with the mainstream, or we can really take a deep dive into other sources and alternatives. And the danger there is, of course, um, there's a lot of misinformation in these alternative sources. I
Mm-hmm.
know I make a habit. I take some pride as a lefty that I read right wing sources. There's a Zero Hedge, which is one I go to every day, and I find some good stuff, and I find some pretty horrible stuff that I don't believe. But I don't find the good stuff anywhere else. I read the
Yeah.
Wall Street Journal religiously because they're more inclined to be critical, as insiders, more critical of capitalism than the New York Times. I see
Fu-
stories on Medicare and the corruption of Medicare and Medicaid, not from the Elon Musk perspective, but the factual in terms of how the health care, the insurance companies are ripping people off. But you don't find that in the New York Times.
Right.
So you really, I mean, to answer your question simply, I really have to work a hell of a lot harder to get information than I did 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with Greg, and I believe a large reason, the main reason for that is because the media companies are struggling for revenue. They can't
Mhm.
hire as many reporters and editors as they used to. They don't have as many gatekeepers. Gosh, I just see horrible, horrible headlines on the internet. And I'm going, oh man, where was the editor? There aren't any.
Right.
They don't, and they don't have reporters, like you said. They don't have the money to send as many reporters to the Middle East. So those areas are being undercovered, underreported.
I'm wondering if, I mean, I was about ready to stick my head in an oven and turn on the gas when I was doing background for this, because the newspapers media has just gone through such remarkable transformation. Most of it's not good. Media consolidation and the influence of all the newspapers signing over their editorial rights to Trump and so forth. But on the other hand, I look at these reporters like Kevin Knosik or who's the guy that we like so much, McLean, the
Alan McLean,
Mint
Alan
Mint
McLeod.
Alan McLean, Mint Press
McLeod.
News, other reporters, and they're on Substack. I mean, some of their content's free, some of it I pay for. In fact, I spend more money on Substack just trying to support these guys. Golly, their reporting is insightful and good and correct. Seymour Hirsch uh, d- was reporting on how we blew up the gas pipeline, and he was considered a quack. And now it's just like common knowledge that we we did, with his reporting. And he just is a guy that, people send $5 a month to, and he pays for his plane tickets and his reporting. Um, who's the guy down in South America?
Glenn Greenwald.
Greenwald. I mean, I don't agree with all the stuff that he does, but boy, he's a good, insightful reporter. Matt Taibbi, same thing. Very insightful. So I'm wondering if I'm actually more informed, but I have to work harder. I have to work a lot harder at it, and I have the time to do that. If you don't have the time, if you're one of the people that can
Well,
only devote so
I
much
guess
energy.
I guess the next question, Pat, would be if it's the case, we've heard this all our lives, that you can't have a democracy unless you have informed voters, informed citizens. Where does that put a democracy or an alleged democracy if we have to forage for information? People work. People have two, three, four children. They have responsibilities. They have to take care for their parents who are old. Imagine you're in your 30s or 40s. How do you get information? Who has time to do what we do? I mean, the three of us all, we can spend an afternoon reading this and reading that, going all over the internet, but that's not the case for the average American.
Right.
And where does that leave their vote? How can they come to a conclusion about who they vote for without that information?
Right. And I'm a big advocate of community journalism, local small papers, because that's where the public has the most power at the local level. I mean, the three of us, we have no influence over Washington, D.C., but we could have influence in local elections. And where do the people who are in Congress right now come from? A lot of them started off, at a city council somewhere or a school board, uh, and then they, went from there to their state legislature, from there to Congress. That's how it works frequently. So, people have more power at the local level than they do at the national level. And I think that's why, local newspapers are even more important in a lot of ways than the big papers. Uh, but they're struggling, and there aren't nearly as many of them as there were 20 years ago.
Right.
And so, I mean, to me, I think it's more important to support local press than the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times.
I want to get back to your book. We got sidetracked. Crossroads of Change.
Okay.
When I visited you in Arizona, you told a pretty interesting story about how you were trying to get the negatives, original negatives of all of your photojournalism. And this is back when you would carry around cameras with a couple of different film speeds and different lenses, and you would actually shoot the
Yeah.
picture, go back to the dark room and see what you got.
Yeah.
And you were looking for you were looking for all of your, I think, very gallery quality photographs. I mean, these are definitely above the average Joe Blow taking pictures. Tell me about that quest, your quest for your negatives.
Well, and the whole reason I was looking for them was because I just wanted to self-publish a book of my photos that I could, hand out to friends and relatives. And but I didn't know I because I was shooting the pictures for the newspaper kept the negatives. And then when the original publisher of the West Valley View sold the paper, the person who purchased the newspaper from him, who was not a journalist, says, I don't want that stuff. I don't want the negatives. I don't want the old photos. I don't want the back issues that were in the bound volumes, which to me was a real head scratcher. I mean, why wouldn't you want those? I mean, those are a great source of research, but he didn't. So the publisher that I worked for, he took those things and donated them to the local historical society. And so I called him up and asked him if he knew where the negatives were, and that's what he told me. He had donated them to the historical society. So here I am. Oh my God, I'm so old now that everything I did is now part of history. So I went to the historical society and they said, oh, well, I don't know. We don't know where, they could be in our storage area. You could go down there and look. And they had this building that's at the Phoenix Goodyear Airport, and I had to go over there and rummage through all this stuff they had in storage, but never found the negatives. Did find the prints that we made that we used when we were putting a newspaper together. We actually had to make physical prints of the pictures that were going to be published. Fortunately, they kept those. So, but the negatives would have been so much better because, I mean, if you're shooting 3 or 4 rolls of film at a specific event and you only pick one to run in the newspaper, that doesn't mean that the rest of the pictures, the rest of the negatives are bad. It just means, well, we only had room for one picture. So here we
Right.
go. So to me, it was a tremendous loss, a loss of history. But anyway, they allowed me to use their resources and then came up with the idea of, wow, why don't we do an exhibit of these photos?
We stopped by the museum where they're at and the heritage in Litchfield, is that it? Is
Litchfield
in
Park,
Litchfield Park, and
the
they are
P.W. Litchfield Heritage Center.
right. What I liked about this is, Jim, is how you can just see the history of Phoenix coming from this farm community and military base and, not a lot of population to this bustling place that it is today.
Yeah.
Um, how would you, it sounds like you had probably one of the best jobs in the world. You'd go into the editor in the morning, he'd say, go get a picture of that guy that just won the $1 million lottery. And
Yeah.
then what would that day look like?
Well, I never knew what my days were going to look like when I got to the office because, I mean, that's the nature of news. Uh, and So usually it would reporter would set up the or make the arrangements for example, the guy who won the $1 million lottery happened to be the city manager of one of the 5 cities we covered, the city of Avondale, and so that was pretty easy. You just call up the city offices and say, hey, could we get a picture of the city manager holding up a copy of his lottery ticket. And so that was pretty easy. So, but I mean, there were other things, breaking news. You just never knew what would happen in the course of
Right,
a day.
right.
Well, now that you're able to pick and choose whatever you want, are you still active? Are you still taking pictures? And uh,
Photography is still a passion of mine. Yes, I
I
still
see.
take pictures.
And are you planning maybe another book or a series of books around your photographs?
Yeah, I am. I'm planning another book that would cover the first newspaper that I worked for as a photographer, which was in the Northwest Valley, and I worked there for 8 years, so I got lots of pictures over the course of 8 years. And that's another newspaper that no longer exists. And in that case, the photographer who was working for that paper when it folded got in touch with me and says, "Hey, I've got these boxes and boxes of negatives. Nobody wants them. Do you want them?" I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll take them."
Right. How would you hung out with Goldwater? You hung out with McCain, with Dan Quayle. I mean, did you follow them enough? Did they know who you were when, I
Well,
mean,
Goldwater, I don't think he would recognize me from one time to another. McCain, yeah.
uh-huh. Tell me about
Uh,
McCain.
well, I mean, he came out here frequently. I mean, this was part of his, you know, you know, we were his constituents, and he
Hmm.
did come by and speak to local groups. And when he did, we would cover him. And afterwards, a lot of times we sit down and talk with him. So, and I didn't agree with his politics all the time, but I did respect him. I thought, he was very smart,
Mm.
and B, I think that he had some integrity. So, which I don't believe of a lot of politicians nowadays.
Hmm.
I guess that was always true, though. There were politicians who had integrity and those who don't.
Did
Uh,
Dan Quayle have much integrity?
oh, well, I don't. I took a picture of him playing golf. That was about it.
Oh,
Whether
okay.
whether I could determine whether he had integrity or not, I had to depend on what other people were reporting. He
He
did
was a
not
very
know how to spell potatoes, but
he was a very handsome man. How about the governor? Who was the governor that you ended up sending to jail or doing
oh,
meet
Evan
meet?
Meekum.
Tell
Evan,
me about him.
well, Evan Meekum was a car salesman. He owned a car dealership or two, and in the gubernatorial race in Arizona in 1988, uh, he was running. Who was he running against? Gosh, I can't remember now. But then, as a Republican, he was running as a Republican, and then a, a second Democrat entered the race and split the ticket, and that enabled Meekum to be elected, even though everybody knew he was a nutcase.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and So he did get elected on a fluke because the Democrats shot themselves in the foot. And that was in 88. And in 89, he was impeached. And one of the charges against him was that he was funneling public money into his car dealerships.
Oh, shocked. And right here in River City. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's gambling going on. There's
Right.
gambling. Shocked.
But
Would
he
would
was he was a character. I mean, he was a racist. He believed that he literally had them put tinfoil up on the windows in his office in the governor's tower because he felt it would block any kind of surveillance that the state
Oh
attorney
God.
general's office was trying to conduct on him. So
Tell me about the military base. You have a couple of shots where you are actually in a jet, refueling, and
yeah, KC-135 refueling tanker.
how would you end up? How would they end up putting a Joe Blow photojournalist in the back seat of a F-17?
Oh, no, no, no. I never got to ride in an F-16. I wish that was a dream of mine, but I never got the opportunity. I
What
was
was this
only in the
jet?
refueling tanker. Those are big planes. They were like 707s.
Okay, okay, okay. And
And
the
and this was, oh God, this was a junket. I mean, they they the Air Force, the Luke Air Force Base, the unit was sending a crew up to Nellis Air Force Base to participate in what they call Gunsmoke, which is sort of an Air Force version of Top Gun. It was a competition. And so, they were really trying to promote this. I mean, the Navy got such a recruitment boost because of that movie, Top Gun, the original, that the Air Force was trying desperately to get some sort of boost out of their competition too. So they just invited all the local media to get in this plane and go up there and they refueled the F-16s over the Grand Canyon to make the best pictures. And So we had a plane full of photographers, basically.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not as good a story as you being strapped into a jet doing barrel
Yeah, I
rolls.
thought I thought the book reflects though how important the military is, the Air Force in particular, in the Southwest, not just in your area, but even around your area. That's such a big player because it's an area where there's so many bases and so much
Oh,
activity.
yeah. And that
Yeah,
was a
the
big issue, that all of this development that was happening out here, uh, when that base was built, it was out in the middle of nowhere. In 1941, Luke Field that was built. And there was nothing around it. But as Phoenix grew and started to spread out, they started building residential developments closer and closer to the base, which threatened it in like back in the 90s when they had the the base realignment and closure uh, thing going on. And they were afraid that they would close Luke Air Force Base out here, and that would be devastating to the local economy. Uh, so they started passing laws restricting development within a certain, you know, perimeter around Luke Air Force Base. And most of the cities went along with it, thought it was a good idea, but then there were some that didn't. So,
Do you admire the work of other photographers? I mean, is that something you do? Is look at the work of, like, I remember as a kid, when I think of photographer, I think of Richard Avedon. I mean, I used to
oh yeah,
read his book, the book that was put out with some of his work over and over. I never got tired of looking at those pictures. Do you
oh
admire there's some
oh,
photographers
absolutely,
of
yeah.
note that you
All
would
of the old
recommend?
masters, Richard Avedon, Ansel Adams, of course. Oh God, Caponegro, uh, Weston. There are a bunch of Westons. So,
Mhm.
uh, yeah, I studied the works of the masters, the people who were considered master photographers. So,
My my taste even ranged to some of the vulgar. I have a collection of Ouija's
oh yeah, yeah.
pictures, which are very morbid and
Well,
but it's
you're from Pittsburgh, right?
I am. Mhm.
Okay. When I worked up in the News Sun, there was a guy I met early on, right after I graduated from college and started my career, a guy named Maury Berman. Maury Berman took a very famous photo of Y.A. Tittle after he'd been tackled,
Yes,
kneeling in the end zone. His
yes,
helmet had been knocked off, and he's got a dribble of blood coming down his forehead. And Maury Berman shot that photo. Maury worked for the Pittsburgh Post Gazette for 50 years.
yeah,
And so you probably, if you grew up in that area, saw some of his photos in the newspaper.
yeah.
But he was,
That's
he was a,
that's an iconic picture. I mean, I
yeah.
can see it. You bring it up and it just pops in my mind. It's almost he's almost prayerful. I mean, he's on his knees, and it's almost he's almost
Right.
praying there. It's
Exactly.
yeah.
And you know what? The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette did not publish that picture
Oh God, why?
because it didn't show any action.
Yeah,
Oh, Jiminy
nothing going
Christmas.
on there. The
So,
vulgarity of editors.
so Maury had the negatives, and he spent a lot of time in my dark room. He'd come over and just, sit there shooting the shit. And he brought his negatives over one time and says, "Hey, you want to print a couple copies of this picture?" I said, "Sure." So I did, mounted them, he signed it. It was great.
So when you would do a like a shot at the rodeo all day, or when you were what was it, the packers, the people go up in the mountains with the horses, or
Oh, yeah,
uh,
the trail rides.
the trail rides, when you would do that, would you come home or would you come in the afternoon and then go right into the dark room and see what you got?
Oh yeah, I was always that eager to see what I got. I wanted to process that film, especially if I felt like I got a really good shot. I didn't want to wait. I wanted to process it right away.
And that must have been so, it's the intermittent reinforcement. You just would go, yeah, yeah. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, how did I get that Bronco guy? Or,
Yeah.
I mean, you'd get something really special. Would you bring people into the dark room and say, hey, look at this one?
No. No,
Okay.
I'd print them and take them out to the newsroom and say, "Look at this one." Stay out of my dark room.
Okay, okay, good, good. Well, hey, this has been fun. It was fun visiting you down in Phoenix. This book is, anybody living in Phoenix or in the area should buy this book because it's just the history of Goodyear and the immigrants and the agriculture, and from the time of being a small town to where it is today. And like you said, it's a real treasure that you were able to at least get the photos. It would have been better if you got all of the negatives, but you can't
Yeah.
have everything. So, and your current photography is much more, I would say, art based, and
Yeah.
you're doing AI and just remarkable stuff. What should I give me a link, and we'll link to some of that stuff,
Okay.
so people can look at that. Um, and I've got one of your pictures hanging in my spare bedroom right now. So I think of it all every time I go in. I think of you. So that's good.
Well, thank you.
Jim, thanks. Any final thoughts, Greg? Any?
Well, it's always enjoyable to chat with Jim. I mean, it's always fun to mix it up around journalism and where it's going and where it's been. And I just underscore what he said earlier. The history of journalism has always been fraught with bias and favoritism because that's the way it is. I mean, people
Oh,
own the
yeah.
newspaper and they
If
they they force that on the people that work for them.
Right.
if you ever read a newspaper from like back in the 1880s, 1890s, around there, I mean, you would be shocked at how biased they were.
Yeah, and sensational. And that's the
Right.
thing we didn't touch really on today, but so much of journalism is sensational today, where sensationalism was really wrapped around things like the scandal sheets,
Tabloids.
the tabloids in the past. But now it's in all the newspapers, really. Sensationalism drives it.
I was just going to say the concept of newspapers being fair and balanced was didn't come about until like the Civil War and the rise of the Associated Press, who realized that they could sell their stories to more different newspapers, their coverage of the war, if they took a middle of the road approach, because they could sell to both the papers that were in favor of what was going on as well as those that were opposed to it if they took a middle of the road approach. And that was sort of where the idea of fair and balanced coverage came from. it's not a part of, it hasn't always been a part of American history.
Right.
So,
Well, I'm a little bit pleased. I mean, there's some Schadenfreude going on with the absolute distortion of reality that's been occurring in the conservative press. Not only in the press and not only Fox News, but also with all of the domination of the podcast, Jim, Joe Rogan, so forth, um, and what's interesting now with that, I looked at the stock market before we came on, 1,500 points down, 4%, and it's still diving, with the tariff announcement, and it's interesting to see what happens when reality just knocks you in the in the face. You can spin this stuff. You can spin the fact that all of these terrorists are coming into our country and invading, and but at a certain point in time, the chickens come home. And I don't know. I'm feeling for some reason, and first time in a long time, somewhat optimistic that maybe this will have a course correction in how we do present things.
yeah,
I'm delusional, right?
no. Well,
Maybe.
I don't know whether you're delusional or not, but yeah, I agree with you. I think
Yeah.
that, I guess I'm delusional too, but
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I, yeah, we're in a period of evolution. I mean, we've always been in a period of evolution, but now the evolution is taking place much faster when it comes to journalism, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who knows
Jim,
where it's going to end up? I don't.
yeah. Thank you so much for coming on our show. I just really enjoyed our visit with you and Gail when we were down in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago, and hopefully we'll see you again down there in the summer, in the winter time, our sun,
Yeah, better make it to winter time.
in the winter time. So, and anyway, best of luck to your book. Best of luck to keep shooting pictures.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It
All
Great to
was
right.
see you,
great,
Jim. Great
great
to see
talking
you.
to you guys, Greg.
Yeah,
Hope
all
to see you
right.
again.
All right.